Buenas tardes. Sentimos el retraso, hemos tenido algún problema técnico, pero ya estamos aquí en esta segunda charla sobre la exposición Georgia O'Keeffe, en la que pretendemos centrarnos en esta figura, descubrirla de otras maneras que complementen la visita a la exposición que está en el Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza desde el pasado 20 de abril hasta el próximo 8 de agosto. Esperamos que sea una manera de profundizar más en esta figura y de abrir nuevos caminos para conocerla. Hoy tenemos el honor de tener con nosotros a la escritora Roxana Robinson, autora de novelas y retratos y ensayos cortos. Es también una asidua colaboradora de medios americanos, ha escrito mucho sobre arte americano, y hoy la hemos invitado, queríamos que estuviese con nosotros porque es la autora de la biografía definitiva sobre Georgia O'Keeffe. Ella la escribió y la publicó hace más de 30 años, en 1989, y tenemos la suerte de que se tradujo al castellano tan solo 3 años después y se publicó por la editorial Circe en 1992. Esa edición todavía está disponible en nuestras librerías. Animo a todo el mundo que no la conozca a leerla. De hecho, además, no solamente esa primera edición está en el mercado, sino que hay una nueva edición, una edición revisada que se ha publicado el pasado año en torno a Georgia O'Keeffe en 2020, donde además ella, además de revisar todo el transcurso de su vida, incluye cosas muy novedosas como, por ejemplo, unas cartas que hasta este momento no se habían publicado de Georgia O'Keeffe con un amor de juventud que se llamaba Arthur McMahon. Es desde luego una lectura indispensable para entender la vida y el arte de Georgia O'Keeffe. Para todos aquellos que nos hemos sumergido en ella ha sido un referente también desde luego para la preparación de esta exposición. Estamos enormemente agradecidos de que haya aceptado nuestra invitación. Antes de darle paso a Roxana, me gustaría recordar que hay un chat para preguntas y respuestas que se realizarán al final. Roxana responderá a sus preguntas y respuestas, y después hay transcripción en vivo. Aquellos que deseen escuchar en castellano la conferencia de Roxana deben pinchar en el canal español y tendrán opción de escuchar la traducción simultánea. Roxana, welcome to our virtual Museo Thyssen, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Muchas gracias para invitarme. Estoy muy honrada de estar aquí con ustedes y estoy bien contenta de ver estos cuadros que no puedo ver, pero yo sé que están allí en su museo maravilloso. I can't really speak Spanish, but I want to honor this event, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it. I want to talk today about Georgia O'Keeffe, of course, and her life, and to talk a little bit about the question of courage. And see if I can make this work. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, and you can see from her face and from her bearing that she is a woman of fortitude. And courage has a great deal to do with an artist's life. It's a very demanding part to play in the world. Every artist must find her own way to her art. To create a new kind of art, you are creating a new vision of the world. And it means that you let go of what came before. It means that you leave the group in which you grew up. You strike out alone, and this takes courage. Now, courage is something you only need when you're afraid. It doesn't take courage to do something that doesn't frighten you. So courage was something that O'Keeffe needed over and over. She once wrote, "I'm frightened all the time, scared to death, but I never let it stop me, never." So her life and her work reflect this courage and the great joy that she found in those things, her life and her work. She was born in 1887 in a farmhouse in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. Her parents were quite successful and prosperous farmers. They had 7 children. She was the second and the oldest of 5 girls, and that gave her a position of great power within the family, and that gave her a feeling of power in the world. Her younger sister, Catherine, said, she was our queen, and we all loved her. Her grandparents were pioneers who had come across the country in ox carts and broke the sod and created farmland. It was land that was already occupied by other people, but at that time, they thought it was empty. In any case, farming that land required enormous amounts of courage and self-reliance and independence. And that's what O'Keeffe's family ethos was: self-reliance and courage and independence. She early on, she knew she wanted to be an artist, and she always had lessons in art. And the family moved to Virginia when she was a teenager, and she went to boarding school, and then she went on to study at the Art Institute of Chicago. She received instruction that was completely based on European art, on the old masters, on drawing from antique classical plaster sculptures, drawing from geometric objects, cubes, and circles to show how to use light and shade. But it was all based on European art. And then after she studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, she went on to New York, where she studied with William Merritt Chase, who was a famous, very fashionable, very grand, and distinguished American artist. His work was based a little bit on Impressionism. This is not an example of the Impressionist part, but he painted ladies of leisure. He painted people in the country relaxing. He painted very dramatic, very elegant and luxurious studio scenes. He had studied in Munich, and he was a master of the brushstroke, the virtuoso brushstroke. He painted lots of still lifes, among them this one of fish, and you can see the European influence on him. He was also very handsome and very dashing. He wore a high top hat and spats. And so he sort of personified the successful artist. And O'Keeffe was a very good student, and her second year there, she won a prize for a still life that she painted, which was this. A dead rabbit with copper pot. And you can see she's interested in textures, in light and shade. And this is very much a painting done in the European tradition. So she succeeded at this. This is 1908, but it sort of stopped her because she felt that she had done what her teacher could do. He was very successful. And if that was all there was to painting, she didn't know where to go next. Her family was running out of money at that point, and she could no longer take classes in New York, and she became a commercial artist. She moved to Chicago again, stayed with family, and became a commercial artist, which she hated. And she really felt at that moment that she had come to the end of her career as an artist. She didn't know, she couldn't carry on as a commercial artist. She hated being told what to do. And she thought she had done what an artist had to do. She had painted exactly like her teacher, and she didn't see a way forward. Now, the time between art school and the recognition of the world is a dangerous place for an artist, because in that space, before the world recognizes what you do, you may lose your commitment, you may lose your courage, and you may fail the mission. And O'Keeffe nearly did fail the mission. She stopped painting altogether when she came back from Chicago. She hated the work, and she came home and she stopped painting. But what happened was she took a course in 1912 at the University of Virginia. The family had moved to Virginia, to Charlottesville, where the university is. And she took a class there with an artist who'd studied, with a professor who had studied with a man called Arthur Wesley Dow. And unlike most of her professors, he did not look towards Europe. Now this is a little dark, I hope you can see it, but it's a very beautiful landscape called August Moon, and it was done about 1905. And in this picture, you can see what Arthur Dow was doing. He had been influenced by Asian art, not by European art. And his approach to teaching was completely different. At the Art Institute of Chicago, O'Keeffe had been told to copy the old masters, literally to sit in front of a Titian and copy it, stroke for stroke. What Dow said to his students was, take a sheet of paper, use 2 lines, and make 3 beautiful spaces. So he was asking the students to take agency and to create their own kind of beauty. And he said at one point, let me find you this wonderful quote. He said, "It is not the province of the landscape painter to represent so much topography, but to express an emotion." And so his works were full of emotion. He also was interested in pattern and repetition, harmonies and wholeness. And we will see those ideas recur in O'Keeffe's work. Now, she had already been exposed to abstract art. She'd seen some in New York City, but she hadn't yet begun to use it in her own work. But this idea of Arthur Dow's, which was take agency and infuse what you see with your own emotion, paint your expressive response to a landscape instead of the careful conventional version of that. Put your own feelings into it. That was something that liberated O'Keeffe, and the idea that she could create her own images. That was very important. So this is O'Keeffe right at that time. This is 1915, when she not only took that course from that teacher, but she came back the following year. And for the next 3 years, she either taught or assisted this professor teaching that class. She became very well versed with these ideas of agency, giving agency to the student, harmonies, repetitions, and delivering emotion. Now, at the end of that year, 1915, now, 1915 was a very important year in her life. So that summer, when she's teaching at the University of Virginia Summer School, she became very close to another teacher there who was a graduate student in political science. And he was a student at Columbia University in New York. And this is Arthur McMahon. He was handsome, as you can see. He was very energetic, and he loved walking in the woods and wilderness, which O'Keeffe did. And the two of them took walks all summer long. He was also interested in ideas. He introduced her to all sorts of philosophy and political ideas, as well as feminism. His mother was a feminist, and so he was one of the first people to introduce Georgia to those ideas. So all summer long, they walked and talked. It didn't seem during that summer as though there was any romantic engagement, but they certainly became very close. And during that summer, it seems as though O'Keeffe created the first abstractions that we know about. And this is special number 32. It was done that summer, and O'Keeffe sent it to someone later on that fall, and she describes it and says, "This is political science in me." She rarely used names when she wrote letters about people, so you have to identify them through their appearance or what they do. So she calls Arthur McMahon political science. "This is political science in me, dabbling our feet in the water. It is about 15 feet deep, right under our feet. It is red from the red clay, and it comes down with a rush, like all the mountain streams. He got me to put my feet in because he said the motion of the water had such a fine rhythm." And then she also wrote, "These abstractions were done after having a conversation with a friend about abstractions from nature. I went home and made 2 pastels to illustrate to him what I meant." So that summer of 1915, she was beginning to work in purely abstract terms. And we have these two, there's a similar one, these 2 beautiful images to demonstrate that. That fall, she moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where she taught at a small women's college. She and McMahon wrote to each other all fall with increasing intimacy. Now, the spring before, she had gone back to New York to get her degree, her teaching degree at Teachers College, which is where Arthur Wesley Dow taught. So she had studied with him himself. She also met there a woman called Anita Politzer, who was another student and who would become a lifelong friend of O'Keeffe's. And so because her letters are extant, we know a lot about what O'Keeffe was doing during this period. So she writes to Anita Politzer, and it's from those letters to Anita that we can feel that O'Keeffe is falling in love with Arthur McMahon. And McMahon decides to come down and visit her at Thanksgiving at the end of November in Columbia, South Carolina. And she says to Anita, "I am so glad about something that I'm almost afraid I'm going to die. I wonder if you can imagine how glad I am." It's language we don't expect to hear from O'Keeffe, whom we think of as being very reserved and cool, but she was actually madly in love with Arthur McMahon. He comes down for Thanksgiving, which is a wild success. Georgia wrote Anita, "We had a wonderful time." This is after he's left. "And today I feel stunned. The world looks all new to me." So McMahon's visit was part of a galvanizing moment for O'Keeffe. And during the next 4 weeks, during the month of December, she stayed at that girls' college. And after everyone went home for Christmas, she put down all her work on the floor, looked at things that were derivative, put them to one side, and started creating the series of pictures that show O'Keeffe as a great new voice. This is, this was a series of charcoal drawings, and they were specifically messages to Arthur McMahon, with whom she was in love. She says to him, she wrote to him, "I said something to you on paper." This is image number 10. It's from the Menil. It's incredibly beautiful and also very powerful and controlled. You can see that this is someone who knows exactly how to master the medium of charcoal, where to push hard, where to go light, exactly how to do shadows and distance and mass and weight. Here she has moved fully into abstraction. She draws on natural forms, which she will continue to do for the rest of her career. She makes shapes that we can recognize, though we can't identify them exactly: rising, swirling, furling, and unfurling. This unfurling shape will reverberate in her consciousness, and it will recur in her work. It refers to plants and clouds, air and water. It's familiar to us in a deep and intuitive way, and this is one of O'Keeffe's great strengths: the use of images that we recognize on a profound and intimate level. She did a series of these drawings, and she sent them to Anita Politzer, and Anita Politzer took them to Alfred Stieglitz. Now, Alfred Stieglitz was an incredibly important person in the American art world. He was the first person really to introduce modern European art to New York. He had shown Cézanne and Picasso and Rodin. And O'Keeffe had known about him when she was studying in New York at the Art Students League. Everyone knew about Stieglitz. He was also a pioneer photographer, both doing his own work and also championing the work of other new pioneering photographers. And he had a gallery where he showed modern art and modern photographs. He was also flamboyant, dramatic, and charismatic. And all the art students knew about him. And O'Keeffe had gone with her friends to see his gallery, which was called 291, in 1908. She remembered going to see him, and she never spoke to him. She stood in a corner while her friends all talked to him. He was too noisy. The conversation was too uproarious and confrontational, and she thought the exhibition was meaningless to her. It was Rodin drawings. She wasn't interested. So she had encountered him. Their first meeting was in person, but they didn't speak. She knew him through his work. He knew her not at all. But now this is 8 years later, and she has come to know him through a magazine that he put out called Camera Work, which contained modern art and modern thoughts. She loved his work and she loved the magazine. So now she thinks of him differently. And she said to Anita, I would like Alfred Stieglitz to see my work more than anyone. So without telling her, Anita Politzer took these works, these drawings, to Alfred Stieglitz at his gallery, 291. She said, I think there's something you should see. And she unrolled drawing after drawing on his table. And he said famously, looking at them, at last, a woman on paper. Just as a side note, there's some scholarly claim that he didn't actually say that. Anita wrote that note in with a little caret. It's written above the rest of the letter, but it's exactly the kind of thing Stieglitz would say. There's no reason for anyone else to have written it in, and he said it himself in a letter to someone else. So it's very likely that he said it. It's a great comment, and it's exactly what Stieglitz would feel because he loved women. He loved the idea of women, and he was looking. He showed women artists, and he was looking for a woman artist. So this was the first meeting between O'Keeffe's work and Stieglitz. It's still not in person, but there they meet on paper. So afterwards, O'Keeffe writes to Stieglitz and says, could you tell me what you thought of the work? And this begins a correspondence between them. So now they meet on paper through words. And this begins a correspondence which will last for the rest of their lives and comprise thousands and thousands of letters. And it's a very important relationship that gets begun between Stieglitz, who's a dealer, who's a man, who's an artist himself. And this is Alfred Stieglitz right around that time. It's a photograph taken by another photographer, Paul Strand, whose work he showed. He's 24 years older than O'Keeffe. He's been married for 23 years. He has a daughter. He loves women and flirts with them, and I think he's had affairs. But you can see he's a man of great dignity, enormous force, and he's carrying the tools of his profession. That's a slide that a photographer used to make the image. So this was the man that O'Keeffe was talking to, and the man that had now seen her work. O'Keeffe went back to New York. She left Columbia, South Carolina, went back to New York, and finished her degree at Teachers College because she wanted to teach in Texas. While she was there in New York, Stieglitz hung some of her drawings in a group show without telling her. And she heard about it, and she went down to the gallery without telling him and walked in and saw her drawings on the wall without her permission. And she went up to Stieglitz and said, you have no right to hang these pictures. And he said, why do you say that? And she said, I made them. And he said, you have no right to withhold them from the world. So that was the first encounter in the flesh through their work. His work as a dealer, her work as an artist. And they're both, and their physical presences. They had engaged in every way before this moment. And at that moment, they began to engage as human beings. And there was an immediate spark, an immediate attraction. And that would last for the rest of their lives. Now, in the fall, she goes to Texas. And Texas liberates Georgia O'Keeffe. She found a kind of freedom there that she hadn't known before. And this is her standing on the plains. She's in Canyon, Texas, that has its own little tiny Grand Canyon, which is incredibly beautiful and incredibly colorful. And as we all know now, one of the things that enraptured O'Keeffe was color, the idea of color. So this is called it's special number 21, Palo Duro Canyon. That's the canyon, 1916. You can see what's happened here. O'Keeffe is moving into her own way of transcribing the landscape. And that canyon with its broken, intimate, gorgeous forms and color was something that liberated her and made her exultant. She was now freed from an obligation to naturalism, and she could paint the landscape that she felt, not the one she saw. She uses abstraction as a way to amplify emotion. This is a place of fiery colors and vertiginous views, and she makes this like a roller coaster. We are swept into this landscape. She makes us feel we're a part of it. We don't know it, but we do know it, and that's what O'Keeffe's works often do to us. That's an oil, but she also started doing watercolors in Texas, and the watercolors are simply miraculous. They show her as a master of that form. She's really up with the great masters of the world in this medium. These are incredibly bold, and they're authoritative, they are radiant, and they show a kind of daring that is exhilarating to look at. This is Evening Star from the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and you can see how free she's become. The star is a circle of paint, and there's a half circle around it. The landscape is just sketched, and she uses the watercolor with such confidence, such boldness, that we trust her. You trust an artist that is confident in the brushstroke, and that's what O'Keeffe is. These are some of my favorite paintings of all time. These are 3 small watercolors, light coming onto the plains. And just be aware of the incredible mastery of these strokes, how it seems as though the light is radiating. Actually, you would have to put the dark paint on in that oval around the outside and hope that it just fades by the time it gets to the center. But she makes it look as though she's painting with light, that light is the first thing that hits the paper and it radiates outward. She is a master of this medium, and we are in her power and we love it. The fact that she makes that little tiny edge between earth and sky, the fact that she makes us feel the radiance of the sky is transforming this image, is an astonishing part of these pictures. And let me read to you a letter that she wrote to Anita Pulitzer to give you a sense of her response to this landscape. Tonight, I walked into the sunset. The whole sky, and there is so much of it out here, was just blazing, and gray-blue clouds were rioting all through the hotness of it. The whole thing lit up with flashes of lightning. I walked out past the last house, past the last locust tree, and sat on the fence for a long time, just looking at the lightning. You see, there was nothing but sky and flat prairie land. There was a wonderful moon. It is absurd the way I love this country. And the sky, Anita, you have never seen the sky. It is wonderful. So this sense of rapture and exultancy is what comes through in these brilliant pictures from Texas. Excuse me. And this is Starlight Night from 1917, and it also shows this sense of exhilaration and her delight in the natural world and the sky and the atmospherics of the sky. But I also want to draw your attention to the playfulness and whimsy of this picture. And she's playing with the idea of geometry. This is made with a sort of formal grid. You can see lines going down and across, but she's mocking that. She's playing with that idea, saying a grid is not a grid. A formal grid is not geometrical. We know that stars don't form themselves into a grid. So she's asking us to take delight in this notion of a star-filled sky and teasing us about the idea of formality and geometry. Now, during this time, she was living in Texas, where she had gotten a teaching job in Canyon, but she was also still connected to New York, and she made visits there periodically. And through the magazine camera work and through conversations and through her visits, she knew about the work of Paul Strand, who's a young photographer and who was one of Stieglitz's artists. And here he is in 1917, photographed by Stieglitz. You can see he's handsome, vigorous, and also full of force and authority. So what he was doing, he was quite radical. He was very radical for the times. And what he was doing was something that other photographers hadn't figured out or hadn't considered. He was using the mechanics of the camera to create abstract art. And he crops and magnifies the image, which is something that really hadn't been done before. It now is something that we understand very easily, but he was one of the first people to do this. He makes simple, realistic shapes into abstract ones. O'Keeffe loved this idea. It was radical. Nobody had done this before. These are bowls, but they look like patterns of light and dark. And O'Keeffe loved it, and she met him in New York, and she wrote to him and says, "I've been wanting to tell you how much I liked your work. I believe I've been looking at things and seeing them as I thought you might photograph them, making Strand photographs in my head." What Strand was doing with this approach was to strip these objects of all practical and emotional content. He made them into patterns of light and shade. Part of the power of these images lies in the transformation. He transforms them from something that we know into something we don't know. Their only meaning is aesthetic. Their only value here is aesthetic. So O'Keeffe was fascinated by this idea, and she adopted it for her own purposes. She used magnification and cropping, but instead of eliminating the emotion, she multiplies it, she expands it. So she infuses these cropped and magnified subjects with emotion, charging them with vividness and intensity. So by this time, O'Keeffe was turning away from McMahon towards Stieglitz, and their letters became increasingly intimate. They shared so much. They were both so interested in art and ideas and making art and what other people were doing, and also in the natural world. They both loved what they saw around them, and they drew on that for their work. And Stieglitz, as I say, loved women. His letters were very intimate. He talked about O'Keeffe's soul and thought that she was, the essence of womanhood, the essence of purity. So he became very quickly an integral part of her private life. And in 1918, O'Keeffe became ill and came home from Texas, came back from Texas to New York. And Stieglitz moved her into an apartment and left his wife. And from then on, the two of them shared their lives. They wouldn't marry for 6 years, but they became partners then. And this was a partnership that would last for the rest of their lives. And this is a photograph that Stieglitz took of O'Keeffe in 1918. He began a project of photographing her, which he did for years and years, photographing every aspect of her. And you can see that we may think of O'Keeffe as a cold and reserved person, but that's not the way he saw her, certainly not in 1918. This is a woman with whom he fell in love. Her hair down, her gaze interior and abstracted, but warm and engaged and engaging. So this was a woman and she's also wearing underwear. So this is a moment of great intimacy and tenderness. And this is a woman who you understand, whose soul he wants to explore. And they fall deeply in love. Now this is Red Flower of 1919. And Stieglitz took O'Keeffe into his life and took her in the summers up to Lake George to a family house that his family had owned for years and where everyone in the family gathered. It's where he took her that first summer when they fell in love. And the following summer, O'Keeffe did this picture, Red Flower, which is one of her early magnified flowers. And in this, she uses those techniques of Paul Strand, the cropping and the magnifying. But instead of doing what Strand did, she did the opposite. So this picture is infused with a depth of emotion and engagement. This is tender, it's ardent, it's passionate, it's shy. It's the most wonderful expression of love. And when I first saw this picture, I was sort of embarrassed. It wasn't easy to find for years and years. And it is so intimate, I felt I shouldn't really be looking at it. She wrote to a friend that summer, "We are very happy here. I have never been so happy in my life." So this period was one of great happiness for O'Keeffe. She and Stieglitz were working, doing their own work. He was photographing her. They spent the summers at Lake George and the winters in New York. This is an image that Stieglitz took at 1920. There's Georgia in the middle. Paul Rosenfeld, who was a writer, is on the left. Charles Duncan, who was an artist, is on the right. And the plate in the foreground represents Stieglitz, who's taking the picture. And that's a breadboard on the right, and it's carved with the words, "Give us this day our daily bread." So this is an image of great domestic contentment. And it was a moment in O'Keeffe's life when she was very happy with Stieglitz and the life that they led, full of ideas, much of it in the natural world, and full of a kind of domestic peace. And because of that, so during these years, she did these images of fruit that are semi-abstract. Of course, we recognize these as apples, but you see how she polishes and stylizes and simplifies them so that they're what we would now consider almost realistic, but at the time they were partly abstract. She's moving back, she's sharing both of those ideas, abstraction and realism, to give us images that deliver some kind of emotional content. This is Plums of 1920. And she did a whole series of fruit pictures. And to me, they seem a kind of metaphysical declaration of satisfaction with the world. She makes these modest, ordinary fruits, treats them with such simplicity and affection that they serve as visual statements of gratitude, of wholeness and completion. She also began to use the landscape of Lake George. Remember what Dow said about repetition and harmonies? So she draws on that idea of harmonies. Many of her pictures have a sort of a mirror effect so that she reflects one side of the picture with the other. This is dawn at Lake George. Again, it's a landscape that we immediately recognize, but it's also an abstraction, something that she would use throughout her career. This is Georgia O'Keeffe by Stieglitz. I want to tell you something. I met Georgia O'Keeffe once, and what I was surprised by was the fact that she was so short. Stieglitz always photographs her like this to make her look tall, and he gives her an enormous sense of power and authority here. But I think he's sitting on a footstool, and he does that to celebrate O'Keeffe, to show us her power and authority. This is Corn Dark from 1924. Again, she's using the tools, the ideas of a photographer. It would be difficult for a painter to stand over a stalk of corn and to paint that image. It's very easy for a photographer to seize it and then paint it later. So I don't know if she took a photograph of this, but she could have, and she's using that idea of grabbing, seizing an image, and then replicating it, putting it on the canvas. Again, it's abstract. It's both abstract and realistic. We understand that it's a stalk of corn, but it's also an abstraction that balances two rippling forces on either side, that spiraling, unfurling shape in the middle, a kind of chaos, and that line down the center, which we will see over and over. You can read it as light, you can read it as fissure, you can read it as a coupling of both sides, but that's something that will recur. Now, 1926 was a difficult year for O'Keeffe. She and Stieglitz stayed in New York in the spring and then went up to Lake George. In the spring, she painted this great painting. It's one of her greatest flower paintings, Black Iris, 1926. And this is, it's 36 by 30. So it's fairly large. It's not one of those small pictures. But by using cropping and magnification, she makes it monumental. This could be the size of the whole wall. And what she's doing in this picture is showing us an image of female power. This flower painting, as all of her flower paintings can be read as an indication of female, a female subject. We like to think of flowers as female. There's that tender surface, the softness, the fragility of it, the idea of scent. But this flower is deeply potent. There is this sense of darkness, of mystery about it, of power. So she's doing two things at once. She's showing us fragility and tenderness, and also depth and majesty. And this kind of image of female power was rare. O'Keeffe was one of the first to use that idea and show something that was simply female and simply powerful. So she is entering the lists kind of in terms of presenting power. That summer was problematic, and Stieglitz invited house guest after house guest, including 3 beautiful young women with whom he started flirting, and also flirted with the cook. And finally, this feeling of instability and uncertainty and a feeling of being right on the edge of betrayal meant that O'Keeffe simply walked out. She left Lake George and went to Maine. And in Maine, she started doing another series of pictures, and they were not metaphors for ardor or for domestic contentment. This is Open Clamshell, which she did in late that summer or early fall. Again, this is a small picture, 20 by 9. It's small, but it's monumental. So again, she uses cropping and magnification, and she makes this whole image. She doesn't crop the image. She compresses it so that it becomes iconic. This image takes on a larger sense than its actual presence has in the world. She makes it incredibly important, gives it stature. The deep, narrow space is filled by a long, slanting shape that reflects itself. Remember that mirroring. Within it is the silent interior, muted, pearly layers of tissue, subtle and remote. And at the heart of it, there is another opening, dark and mysterious. The palette is muted and restrained. Passion here is absent. So is tenderness, so is vulnerability. Running down the line of the center is the possibility, the open line, a place of possibility and fissure. This image is about removal, withdrawal, and denial. It carries an aura of ominous suspense. The contrast could not be greater between this image and that red flower of 7 years earlier. And this is Closed Clamshell. She did at the same time. Here, the central line no longer shows vulnerability, but closure and denial, prohibition and exclusion. These smooth gray-white halves meet neatly, mirroring each other in a statement of containment and completion. Here is the closed and coupled self, self-containment, self-reliance, and solitude. There is nothing more adamantly closed than this shape, nothing more designed for an exclusion. O'Keeffe was accused of using female imagery, but more important here are the essential qualities of openness and closedness. The cool inevitability of a closed shell, the quiet suspense of a barely opened one, carry larger connotations than a purely sexual interpretation would allow. So these images can be read as a declaration of O'Keeffe's swift removal from Stieglitz. They're statements about privacy, about intimacy, and inner strength. They're a warning of sorts. They're about courage. If O'Keeffe was becoming increasingly aware of the threat that Stieglitz posed to her, she was also increasingly aware of her own inner resources. But she still loved Stieglitz. And this wonderful picture, Radiator Building, Night, New York, 1927, gives us a sense of the passion she still feels for her husband. Skyscrapers were going up in New York. It was a subject for lots of painters. O'Keeffe wanted to get in on that. She did a number of scenes of skyscrapers in the new city. This one I particularly enjoy because, again, it has a sense of playfulness. She uses the idea of a grid, but she plays with it. This is not a grid that's complete or uses formal lines. I love the sense of whimsy. So we have that funny little unfurling shape of steam. We have those funny little ears on either side of the tower. And my favorite part of this picture is, I don't know if you can see it, but to the left, that red bar says Alfred Stieglitz. So she is literally putting her husband's name in lights. It gives you a sense of her delight in him, the love she has of the city, which is a place of great illumination and vitality. And it gives us a sense of her feelings about him. She really does see him as a center in that urban glow, in that urban nighttime. He is a supercharger. So he's one of the stars in her firmament. Now, however, and this picture is 1929. Many of O'Keeffe's paintings, I think, can be read as self-portraits. And this one I would suggest is a self-portrait. This is O'Keeffe herself in the window. They have moved to a skyscraper called the Shelton Towers. And this is a picture. She's done many of these pictures looking out at that industrial landscape, but this one includes this whimsical little female shape, wasp-waisted with a beautiful pink rim, a hidden fruit in the center of it, and those wonderful, playful little leaves. And for me, that suggests O'Keeffe herself looking out on the industrial landscape created by the men, but she is definitely a woman looking at it. And she's having fun with it. So it's a reminder of the playfulness and whimsy that also motivated O'Keeffe. However, clouds appear on the horizon. Dorothy Norman was a beautiful young New York woman. She was married, and she sort of fell in love. She became infatuated with Alfred Stieglitz, and he with her. She started volunteering at the gallery, and she started coming in every day, which had been O'Keeffe's place. She was accustomed to hanging all the shows. She was better at that than anyone. And of course, she was Stieglitz's wife and his artist. So she could go into the gallery anytime. But now it was occupied. The gallery was always holding this new presence, this beautiful young woman who thought Alfred Stieglitz was a god. So this became increasingly difficult for O'Keeffe to deal with, but she had to put up with it. She was not someone who saw herself as a victim. She didn't seem to challenge Stieglitz. O'Keeffe believed in self-reliance. She believed that you found your own happiness. And so she believed that her responsibility was to find happiness, not to capitulate to the circumstances. So one thing she did in 1929, when Dorothy Norman was increasingly in evidence, was to leave New York for New Mexico. She had been there before, but never for such an extended period of time, and she had never seen the beautiful landscape that she found that summer. As you can see, she's enjoying herself. This is a photograph taken in Taos by Rebecca Strand, the wife of that photographer. And she stayed with a society hostess called Mabel Dodge Luhan. And she had a wonderful time in New Mexico. New Mexico was a place that joined that wide sky she'd found in Texas with shapes and earth forms that she had never seen, and really, which don't exist anywhere else on the planet. She found her own happiness. So this is the Lawrence tree. It's a tree outside D.H. Lawrence's house, who was not there. 1929, I love this picture. It's one she said you could turn it either in any direction and it still works and it still stands up. In this, she takes such delight in the natural world. She uses, again, the photographer's trick of using the lens to capture an image that it would be hard for an artist to do. Although I think she lay down on a bench and looked up at this. But you have that vertiginous, wheeling view that that we're not accustomed to, that this is new for us. But this, above all, the sense of beauty and benevolence of the natural world, those beautiful furling, swirling shapes of the branches, and that limitless, exuberant, luxuriant presence of the stars in the night sky. So this is a woman who is finding her own happiness despite the pain that lies in part of her life. She also began to engage, this is at 1930, the next year, with the landscape itself, which was something, a subject that would never tire her. And she found these beautiful unfolding shapes, these melting, soft, but powerful images that are filled with thousands of years of the results of iron ore, which is a very generous mineral, which takes on all sorts of colors. And it was the colors, as well as these lovely, luscious shapes, that enchanted her. So she was finding, although she was in pain, in one part of her life, she was finding joy elsewhere. That same year, she was going out, she had decided to go out to Santa Fe and spend the summer in New Mexico. But before she left the East, she would go to Lake George and open the house for Stieglitz before he got there. And in this year, she did a series of pictures from the Jack in the Pulpit. And I just want to show you this, the way she combines the idea of realism. We understand, once we know the name, we understand what this plant is. Something that anyone who walks in the woods it will recognize, but it is so modern. It is so boldly abstract. There is nothing traditional about this use of clean, swirling, modern forms. So she's really creating a way of looking at the world that we haven't seen before. The fact that O'Keeffe had decided to leave Stieglitz for half a year, and the fact that Stieglitz was having a rampant affair with someone else, puts a distance between them. And this was taken in 1930 or 31 on O'Keeffe's return one of these summers from Santa Fe. And you can see the difference between this woman and the woman that he saw in 1918 with her hair down, wearing practically nothing and engaging him with her eyes. This is a woman who is strong, she's reserved, her hair is tightly bound, she's wearing traveling clothes. There's a very different sense of the relationship here. This is 1929. This was, again, that first summer that she went out. And O'Keeffe was drawn to things in the landscape that spoke deeply to her. And this is Black Cross. And she says, she writes about this, "I saw the crosses often. The Catholic Church lay like a dark veil across the land." This was because there were penitente churches who carried out a sort of a cult version of Catholicism that involved flagellation, which was forbidden, but it still happened. And so that notion of flagellation and pain was contained within these crosses. So this image gives us a sense of O'Keeffe's power. And again, she uses that cropping and magnification and compression to make this image iconic. This takes on a monumentality and a majesty that we hadn't seen before. And in America, these crosses, as you can see, have no connection to the human body. We're accustomed to seeing crosses that carry Jesus, that carry the body in pain. But these crosses are empty and spare. They're abstract, and O'Keeffe uses them as abstract forms, but we understand what they represent. They represent the church, and they also represent, and this is almost so large that it obliterates the landscape, but it doesn't. So O'Keeffe gives us this wonderful, endless, rippling effect of hills reaching out to the horizon and that line of passion and excitement and vitality beyond it. So it's an extraordinary image that immediately, as I say, gives the cross an iconic presence. It's American. It refers specifically to this landscape, but in a way that gives it a kind of power and potency that we don't expect. And O'Keeffe does this. She delivers a kind of importance and significance to the landscape that she paints. However, the presence of Dorothy Norman and Stieglitz's connection to her was having a terrible effect on her. And then something happened in her professional life that was devastating. She agreed to do a project, a mural for the new Rockefeller Center. She agreed without Stieglitz's permission, and Stieglitz was furious when he learned about it. So he was vituperative and offensive to her, mocked her, criticized her in front of his friends, but she was determined to carry out this commission. Yet the building project was way behind times. She was supposed to complete the project and couldn't. The wall was not ready for her to start work on it, and everything came together, and she had a nervous breakdown and was admitted to the hospital in the winter of 1933, and Stieglitz was afraid she would die. Nobody understood exactly what the problem was, but it was serious. She had stopped painting. Stieglitz said he was afraid she would never paint again. And he wasn't allowed to see her in the hospital because she was so upset when she saw him. She later, when she was recovered, took a trip to Bermuda, and some of the first images that she painted, that she created, this is not a painting, after her illness was a series of banana flowers. And this is one that I think is so powerful and so representative of a particular state of mind, this sense of weight and a sense of suspense and a kind of sadness. There's something deeply sad about this image that is suspended in the world. There's some kind of immanence that's part of it. The silence and the stillness and the weight of it create a sense of mysterious pain for me. But through these images, she returned to work. And as I say, courage was what she drew on. She had the courage to return to her life, to find happiness again, to return to her work. She doesn't really tell Stieglitz to stop having an affair, to stop being cruel to her. What she does instead is to find her own way to a kind of life that will sustain her. She keeps going back to New Mexico, the place where she finds the most vitality, the most connection to the world and to her work. This is another one of her great, great paintings. This is From the Far Away Nearby. And when I was writing my book, this is a famous painting and very well known, but it suddenly occurred to me that there were too many antlers on this skull. And I had someone get in touch with a paleontologist. There are 3 sets of antlers on this one skull. So O'Keeffe is creating something that doesn't exist in real life. It's magnificent. What she's doing is celebrating the notion of these animals and the notion of this landscape. And like her other paintings, she's giving us an image that we don't exactly understand, but which we recognize in the deepest parts of our soul. We know that this is about radiance. It's about the beauty of the natural world. It's about the sky. It's about things that last. So we don't have to understand this exactly. There were grumpy male critics who said, these are fetishes, no one understands them. But many, many people understand this. We understand it intuitively. Now, this was done at a period when surrealism was also fashionable, and it has been asked whether or not she was a surrealist. I would say no. because what the surrealists were trying to do was to shock their audiences by juxtaposing things that had no relationship to each other. An apple in the middle of someone's face. But O'Keeffe was doing the opposite. She was juxtaposing things and creating a connection between them. We understand the relationship between this animal that lives on the plains, the skull and the antlers, and that beautiful distant landscape. We understand that relationship. So although it's not naturalism, it's not the school of surrealism either. This is another painting that she did of New Mexico, and you can see the tenderness that she feels for these images, the way she relates them to the idea of human form. You can't look at that without thinking of a human body. It's not, but she infuses it with a sense of tenderness and her own affection for this beautiful, sliding, collapsing land and all that sky. She started painting the bones in the 30s, and Ansel Adams, the great photographer, was a friend of hers and saw her often. And here's a wonderful picture of her, again, taking delight in the landscape and her own part in it. She loved collecting bones, which were there on the landscape. And here she is on a collecting trip in her blue jeans with her big hat, her arms covered and her hands covered, collecting the future subjects for her work. She was still connected to Stieglitz. They had weathered the storm of Dorothy Norman, and O'Keeffe really never wavered in her love. She was angry at Stieglitz. She resented his betrayal of her, but she didn't waver. She always stayed close to him. Though she went to New Mexico, she always made sure that he was taken care of. They wrote each other constantly, sometimes many, many letters a day. They stayed incredibly close. And here's a picture of them around 1938 at Lake George. And this gives you a sense of the fact that their intimacy never faltered and their love really never faltered. And they stayed in this deep sense of connection until his death. Now, this is a woman in the fullest control of her work, of her material, of her subject matter, and of her soul. This is a pelvis. And again, we understand that this is a female orifice, letting the critics go wild. She loved openings. She loved the idea that you could pass through them. But this, again, like the antler picture, puts in relation to each other this sense of the bone, which you can find on the desert, and that ravishing distance. O'Keeffe is great at distance, creating someplace that is so far away from you, you can hardly see it. One thing she understood from Asian work of all sorts was the absence of middle ground. So this has a foreground and a distance, but there is no middle ground, which gives it a sense of unreality. But this is ravishing. Those bones that she found on the desert would be dry and gray often, but she polishes them. These are beautiful, white and radiant. The sense of radiant power in the sky is something that she simply creates. She does things with these shapes and with the distance, the sense of light and sky that hasn't been done before. So again and again, she gives us images we've never heard of, we'd never imagined, but which speak to us intimately. We understand them at once. This is about vitality, it's about endurance, and it's about the great beauty of the natural world. She also, this is her use of landscape. This is darker than I wish it were, but she did a series called Black Place, and these are taken from a place that is not pink sand, it's gray sand. And these are, again, magnificent, monumental images that she makes into iconic presences. She does something odd here. This is a dry landscape, but she makes it almost seem fluid. And it's formed by wind and water, but it's dry. But she gives us that line down the center, that line of fissure, or vulnerability that almost looks like a creek, but it's dry. But that there's that sense of the coupled self, the mirrored parts of this image. But it's exciting, this picture. There's such a sense of majesty and brooding, ominous strength about it. We sort of are humbled by this image, this sense of the landscape as being far more powerful than we are. Now, she moves in the end of the 40s. Now, Stieglitz dies in 1946. So she spends 3 years settling his estate and then moves for good out to New Mexico. And her work thereafter is quieter and drier than the work before Stieglitz's death. She becomes transfixed by this door. Well, this is a window maybe, but she has 2 houses, one in Abiquiu and one at Ghost Ranch, which is in the desert a few miles from the one in Abiquiu. She loves the adobe buildings, and this is a very abstract painting of the wall of a house. You can see she's smoothing away all the identifying features. It looks like a black rectangle, but at the bottom we can see it's part of a natural form. But she is becoming increasingly abstract. She's more and more interested in abstraction. This is the house at Ghost Ranch. You can see how modest it is. She lived there in the summers and she moved in the winters a few miles away to her house in Abiquiu. But this is a traditional kind of architecture. The houses had flat roofs and they had ladders on them, as you can see. And in the summers, when it was hot, people would walk up the ladders to the roof, and they'd sit on the roof at night and look at the stars. This is one of my favorite paintings, Ladder to the Moon. And in this, Georgia was 70. She's 71. It's a painting about transition. I would offer that this is also a self-portrait. The ladder is halfway to the moon. O'Keeffe is halfway to another life, if you will. The moon is half full. You can see the light shading away as your eye rises on the canvas up towards night, where the moon is shining. But it's a joyous, wonderful image. It's a transition that seems exuberant, and the destination, if it's the moon, is a place that's radiant with light. Again, she's playing with these notions. You can call it surrealism. I don't think it is, but it's a surreal kind of image, and yet it's something that we understand. Beneath the ladder is the silhouette of the Pedernal, her favorite mountain with its slanted top. So all of those elements are part of O'Keeffe's life, her beloved Pedernal, the ladder that will carry her up to the moon, and the moon, one of her favorite places. This is the Winter Road of 1963. We know that she took a photograph of this place. This is the road that she sees outside her window at Abiquiu, her bedroom window. And it's wonderful because it's become calligraphy. This is hardly even a painting. It's just a celebration of a line, which has become so sinuous, so snaky, so elegant that we recognize it as a road. It's called the Winter Road, but we also recognize it as something else. It's simply delight in form. So we can see Arthur Wesley Dow's presence there, and we can see O'Keeffe's delight in the natural world here. And we can see how abstract and how simplified her view has become. And this is Sky Above Clouds, 1965. She's 78. And these are huge paintings. This was an enormous task for her to take on at that age. But she did, I think, 3 of them. And they refer to her plane flights. She now had begun to take airplane trips. And on them, she was removed from the earth. So this is again about transition. This is from someone, painted by someone who has left the earth. She sees only the sky. And again, she's playing with that idea of the grid. Remember that starlight night from Texas? Of course, clouds aren't really, they're not formed in a grid, but she's asking us to think of that. And again, there's this sense of radiance, the sense of luminous horizon, and the sense of distance. And it's iconic again. She's created a shape, an image that we'll never forget. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, taken by her friend Ansel Adams in 1981. She had always been a model. People always wanted her to pose for them, photographers and artists. She was a beauty, not a classical beauty, but she had an authority and an elegance about her, a physical elegance. You can see it here. And I would say that she has a kind of courage. It's her courage that allowed her to move through the world without stopping, without pausing. And it was courage that allowed her to create the legacy of work that we are now grateful to be able to enjoy. And I'll end with a quote that was written in the summer of 1916 when she was on a camping trip. She says, "I got to the top alone in the moonlight, just as day was beginning to come. It was great. The wind and the stars and the clouds below. And all the time, I was terribly afraid of snakes." She never let it stop her. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. It was really nice to hear you. It was really a journey through O'Keeffe's life and work. It was also very nice. I'm sure people enjoyed it because not because all the details you mentioned, but also the love you transmit when you speak about her. There's a sense that you are really very deeply connected to her, and also I love how you describe her as a very powerful but also fragile woman, so human being, and also that you have shown so many works that we have not been able to choose for Madrid, so that people know more about her work. And we are receiving many thank you messages. And I have one question, which is the personal experience that you think that has most influenced her work? Which would you say that is the personal experience that was more definite, important to in the development of her work as an artist?
Well, that's a great question, but it's a hard one because there were many moments, and I was excited to learn. I only realized recently about that picture, that abstract picture of the red clay. I only realized recently that where that stood, that it came before the charcoal pictures. So for me, it was very exciting to see that that could be an artistic response to an intellectual conversation. They were just talking, and those paintings were a way for her to explain something intellectual. So that was very exciting for me, that idea that she could transform intellectual ideas into a physical painting. But I would also say that the paintings that she did in Texas, that feeling of liberation, the fact that she went to Texas where she knew nobody and she was free in a free land, and all that sky, I think those pictures are extraordinary. So that experience was hugely important. And the fact that Stieglitz betrayed her. He betrayed her as her dealer, as her husband, and as her supporter. And out of that betrayal came those great images, the Black Cross and the Lawrence tree, and From the Far Away Nearby. I think those came out of her concentrated strength, her courage to combat this feeling of despair that might have taken her over. So I can't answer that except in a number of ways, but it's a good question.
Muchas gracias, Roxana. Thank you very much for being with us today.